But first, before we get to the fun, we've got to eat our vegetables. So, at a time of historically low approval ratings, low confidence, and a crisis of legitimacy, the Supreme Court was like, let's shovel a bit more on, shall we?
Wait. They have a crisis of legitimacy? What, did they do something crazy? Like take away half of the rights of half of the population of the United States?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What did they do? Something crazy like reverse a 50-year precedent with no sound legal reasoning? Yeah, exactly. But that's all the true, that's the thing. Legitimacy crises can come from so many different angles. You can be bad at your job, as they clearly are, but you can also be corrupt in your job, which we now know they clearly are.
Which, interestingly enough, those two things seem to go hand in hand. It's almost as if corruption can infringe on your ability to do your job. Therefore, maybe we should try to prevent that corruption so you can do your job properly.
Whoa, Nathan. Listen to Tips for Good last week. That's a bold claim.
That is a bold claim. That is a bold claim.
Very bold. So,
well, then let's defend it.
Yeah. So the reason we're talking about this is because of recent reporting, primarily from ProPublica, but a number of outlets have been putting out investigations into
which mad credit to ProPublica. All right, ProPublica is a wonderful investigative outlet. It's a wonderful outlet, and it did its due diligence. I know that on the pod we often criticize the media for instances where they don't do a good job at holding speaking truth to power and holding those in power accountable. ProPublica is one of those outlets that actually does have a pretty good track record at doing that. So huge credit to ProPublica.
And definitely in this case, reading through where they're getting evidence for some of these allegations, it's like, oh my God, you went through all the FAA records. Okay, but we'll get there. So basically ProPublica has put out these articles focusing on Justice Clarence Thomas and revelations that he has had a multi-decade long relationship with a billionaire named Harlan Crow, which has included a bunch of shady shit that we'll get into. We've talked about Clarence Thomas before, mainly focused on his batshit crazy viewpoints, which seem to be tenuously related to reality and even less tenuously related to the law. And you might
as my wife likes to call him, Justice Clarence, fuck you, got mine Thomas.
Well, dude, it's so true. And that's even more accurate given all this corruption stuff. But you may be like, wait a second, didn't we hear about corruption and Clarence Thomas and a whole thing recently? In which case you'd be thinking about the incident, I think last year, where Thomas failed to recuse himself from a case that touched on involvement of his wife, Ginny Thomas, in efforts to overturn the 2020 election, which caused general outrage, outcry, and kind of shined a bit of a spotlight on the lack of oversight, ethics rules, and any kind of enforcement mechanisms in the Supreme Court. And this case blows all of that even further out of the water.
And what's so funny about it is that it also goes against the persona that he's tried to put on for the public.
I know.
So there was a documentary, which, by the way, was actually partially funded by Crow, which is hilarious, where Thomas said, quote, "I don't have any problem with going to Europe, but I prefer the United States. I prefer seeing the regular parts of the United States. I prefer the RV parks. I prefer the Walmart parking lots to the beaches and things like that. There's something normal to me about it. I come from regular stock, and I prefer that. I prefer being around that." Bull fucking shit! And again, the guy that funded lavish trips on yachts with full staff that were catering to his every needs, that were going to places like fucking Indonesia.
Yeah.
He helped fund this documentary in which he said this bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's so hilarious and ironic. And partly what's so absurd about those claims is that No, you don't. Like, no one does. Why would you prefer a parking lot to a beach?
A Walmart parking lot.
Why would anyone prefer that? Like,
I think he thinks that that's what normal people do. Like, that's what poor people do. It's like, yeah, I'm like one of the poors. They vacation at what? Like, I don't know. They spend a lot of time at Walmart.
Yeah.
I mean, Walmart parking lots, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what normal people do. They take their RV and go to Walmart parking lots and have a fucking barbecue.
Yeah, it's like when what was it when Dr. Oz was like talking about the price of like crudité or something? Like, it's like don't.
This is what normal people do, right?
Yeah, that's oh god, it's so funny. I love it when out of touch people try to be relatable. It's the best. So let's talk about what actually like is going on here. So we should probably talk at least a little bit about Harlan Crow to establish kind of his bona fides as a horrible, corrupting piece of shit.
Yeah.
So let's start by talking about Harlan Crow. So Harlan Crow is a billionaire real estate magnate.
Like him
already that puts him a little on the shit list. Although, you get some nice billionaires out there that shouldn't be billionaires, and the good ones are working hard at getting rid of all their money. But Harlan Crow is not one of those people. One of the ways we know that he's not one of those people is his long history of being an influential figure in pro-business conservative politics. So he has spent millions of dollars on like efforts to shape laws and the ideology of the judiciary, including like donating significant amounts of money to the Federalist Society, which is the conservative organization that basically crafted the lists of federal that like Trump picked names of federal justices and judges when he was like flooding the court with not only overtly conservative people but also like unqualified people. Those people were coming from Federalist Society lists, which is an organization that Crow like directly funded. He also has given millions of dollars to groups to push for tort reform and for just general conservative jurisprudence. And he's also given significant amounts of money to AEI and the Hoover Institution, which are conservative think tanks on which he sits on the board, which publish scholarship to advance conservative legal theories, as well as file amicus briefs in front of the Supreme Court, which is basically an amicus brief is essentially when someone who's not a party to a case files a document with the court arguing, like adding in additional evidence and argumentation in favor of the particular side that they support in that Supreme Court case.
I'm sorry, there's a conservative think tank group called the Hoover Institute.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, talk about saying the quiet part out loud, bros.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah. And so like these are reasons why Harlan Crow is like a very conservative, pro-capitalist, like hardcore billionaire. Revelations have come out as well that make him like even worse than that. Like there's been reporting about like significant amounts of like Nazi memorabilia in his house because he's like a collector apparently, which is like not
why
chill.
Can't billionaires ever collect normal things? Like why does it always have to be like really weird shit like that?
Yeah,
or like really bad things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't really get it. I don't get the obsession. But he's got like, documents that were signed by Hitler. I think he's got a signed copy of Mein Kampf. He's got like a ton of memorabilia.
Why do you want that?
Exactly.
Why do you want that?
And if you're already a conservative like activist, why even risk the notion that you might actually be a Nazi by having rooms full of Nazi shit? Like in Indiana Jones, when he gets to like the Nazi camps or whatever, and there's swastikas all over everything, he does he performs a very quick and easy leap, which is, these might be Nazis.
Yeah. One of my favorite lines in the entire Indiana Jones franchise is Nazis. I hate these guys.
Yeah, if only our Supreme Court justices could live up to Indiana Jones.
Maybe we should put Indy on the fucking Supreme Court.
We go.
Honestly, he'd probably do a better job.
He probably would, and he'd have more historical context.
That is true. Yeah.
So we've established Harlan Crow as a piece of shit. We've established Clarence Thomas as a piece of shit. And now we're going to establish that these two pieces of shit have been floating around in the same toilet for 20 years. So
I do not want to picture that. Nobody, and apparently, I guess in this analogy, nobody ever flushed. They just, left it there.
Well,
they just left it
the
there.
only way you can flush a Supreme Court piece of shit is via impeachment. And we don't have any of the votes to impeach a Supreme Court piece of shit.
That is true.
Okay, so just to put this in a little bit further context as well, like, I don't know about you, Nathan. I don't know how much Supreme Court justices make. Maybe it's millions. If it's millions, like, having a billionaire friend, like, treat you to some stuff is not cool, but, like, it's not, it's still, like, in the league of life that you might be living already. You might already be going on trips to Indonesia on, like, private planes and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the case. So Thomas, as a Supreme Court justice, makes about $285,000 a year, which is a hefty salary. That's a very nice salary.
I'd take that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would take that for sure in a second. Although that doesn't put him anywhere near the league of being able to run in the social circles of someone like Harlan Crow, who is a billionaire. That salary, that entire salary, is less than half of the value of one of the vacations that Clarence Thomas was taken on with Harlan Crow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about, like, someone who's, like, only able to live at a certain standard, a certain lifestyle, in, like, going on lavish vacations, going to retreats, taking private jets with Crow, like, only able to experience those things.
Going as a result, private resort.
Yeah, exactly. Private resort, which importantly wasn't even owned by Harlan Crow. It's owned by one of his companies, which is important because, like, according to the ethics standards, that we can get into this, you're allowed to be hosted. Yeah. But, like, if you're being hosted by a company and not a friend, that's pretty different.
Yeah. And look, so there are also rules about how much money a gift or something of value can be that you receive. Mm-hmm. And it's different for different parts of government. For example, in Congress, you're generally prohibited from taking gifts that are worth $50 or more.
Yeah.
And if you're going to go on a trip with somebody, it has to be pre-approved by an ethics committee. Mm-hmm. For the Supreme Court, justices, according to ProPublica, are generally required to at least report gifts that are worth more than $415, which a gift in this case is defined as anything of value. And like Michael said, the only exception to that rule is if you go to a friend's private residence and they host you for dinner or something like that, which totally makes sense. I mean, I don't need to know that, you decided to go over to your friend's house for lasagna or whatever. Like we don't need to know that doesn't matter. However, when it comes to paying for transportation, that shit needs to be disclosed. When it comes to a resort that in this case was not necessarily owned by Crow personally, it was owned by his company, that needs to be disclosed. Yeah. And also, Crow was apparently paying for the private school tuition of Clarence Thomas's grandnephew, who he himself has indicated that he's raising this guy as a son, a tuition which is $6,000 a month.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, that is something of value.
Seriously. So I think that's a really important thing to call out, because to your point, Nathan, like, maybe if we give Clarence Thomas a huge benefit of the doubt, maybe Crow and he are very close friends. And we can talk about the fact that a Supreme Court justice is friends with someone who collects Nazi memorabilia. But, like, Clarence Thomas, we already knew he was a piece of shit.
A black Supreme Court justice
Yeah, but again, like this is just
somebody who collects Nazi memorabilia.
Yeah,
I'm just saying, bro.
Yeah,
I'd be a little nervous around that dude.
Yeah, but again, this is like questioning like their personal choices, and like, so if you like give him a bunch of benefit of the doubt, maybe he's just friends with Crow. Crow wants him to hang out, but Crow's not going to hang out in the kind of places that Clarence Thomas can afford, so he takes him on lavish trips. And maybe Clarence Thomas misunderstood the ethics requirements for like disclosure and recusal and things like that, and maybe just got it wrong. But that's the thing. There are certain things that you might get from a friend. You might stay at a friend's house. They might pay for your bus ticket. They might pay for your dinner. There are certain things that no one gets from their friends.
Yeah.
And things like having someone that Clarence Thomas, raises as a son, his grandnephew, having his tuition paid for by someone is like, that's not really a gift. And or it's not like a normal gift. And most importantly, or something that I find really interesting, is that Thomas got another gift from other friends. At one point, he received $5,000 from another friend in support of this grandnephew's tuition, which is a very generous and very unusual gift. And you know what he did? He fucking disclosed it. And yet he didn't disclose the $6,000 a month he was getting from Harlan Crow, which if Crow covered the cost over the 4 years, that's well over like $150,000 in payment, which again, if you're making $285,000 a year, like $150,000 or $6,000 a month is a really significant cost.
Yeah.
Not something that you would like pass off lightly.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's really important here is that we can have an argument about what were the actual intentions.
Mm-hmm.
And, a person can also make the argument that, well, you can't prove that these gifts had an impact on a person's voting record or on a person's rulings. You can't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. But here's the thing. When it comes to bribery, you don't have to prove that. When it comes to normal cases of bribery, you don't have to prove that. Evident, again, by the fact that there is a certain amount of money in gifts that a Supreme Court justice has to disclose. Considering the fact that in Congress, you can't accept a gift that is more than $50, and you have to disclose trips before you go on them.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because, yes, bribery is really difficult to prove in terms of intent, but you don't need to prove intent in order to prove bribery. You just have to prove that somebody has given somebody something significant of value, and that puts that makes their judgment compromised overall.
Yeah.
So a retired federal judge, Nancy Gertner, said, quote, "It's incomprehensible to me that someone would do this." And she said that when she was on the bench, she was so cautious about appearances, not just what she was doing, but the appearance of what she was doing. She was so cautious that when she would make dinner reservations, she wouldn't even mention her title. She would be very careful not to even mention her title.
Yeah, of
because
course.
The important thing here is not just like the important question here is not just whether or not these actually did impact his rulings. It's, does it appear that way? And again, I know that normally appearances shouldn't matter, but when it comes to public trust, when it comes to whether or not a public figure has been compromised by a monumentally wealthy person that has a very clear political agenda, appearances sure as hell do matter.
Yeah.
And that is why when it comes to bribery, you don't even necessarily have to prove what's in the person's mind. You don't even necessarily have to prove that that specific bribe is what ultimately led them to vote this specific way. It's just the fact that the person gave them the money and they are in that position, or that thing of value, and they are in that position that is necessary for determining whether or not a bribe happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's why we have ethics rules, right? And that's why you have ethics rules, so you can discipline and you can and you can censure and you can have consequences for things that you might not be able to prove in court, right? To your point, like bribery can be very difficult to prove, but forcing you to comply with ethics standards is meant to enable us to avoid even having to get to that stage. And to your point about the appearance of impropriety, this is like table stakes for ethics stuff for public servants. Like the code of conduct for federal judges, which sit below the Supreme Court, requires them to avoid even the, quote, appearance of impropriety. To your point, it's about the fact that federal judges sit for their, like, have lifetime tenure, right? And they're like supposed to be above reproach, right? They're supposed to be bastions of well-balanced interpretations of the law. And we know that that's like, you know, an archetype. It's like too far beyond, but they're at the very least not supposed to be swayed by their relationships or the people that are like funding their life and funding the lives of the people that they care about. Like if you were applying to be in the CIA and you were getting money from third parties to pay for your kid to go to a private school, or as is also the case here, Justice Thomas's mother lives in a home owned by Harlan Crow, and she lives there for free, right? The fact that like you could easily be influenced, like overtly or implicitly, by the fact that someone has direct control over whether your mother gets kicked out of her house or whether your grandnephew who you raise and love like a son gets kicked out of school. Like that's beyond an appearance of impropriety.
Yeah. One of Crow's defenses was basically, this is exactly how I treat all my friends.
Mm-hmm.
To which my response was, okay, who are those friends? Give me a list of names because I want to see if there are any people in Congress that are on that list. I want to see if there are any other people of power that are on that list. Because, you know, that would be worse. Okay.
Yeah. No kidding.
But like, do you seriously expect us to believe? And like, you don't even necessarily have to prove this one way or another, but I mean, on a personal level, do you seriously expect me to believe that you're paying $6,000 a month to his grandnephew?
Yeah.
Because you just love Thomas's winning personality?
Exactly.
I mean, okay, maybe that is it, but it doesn't matter ultimately, because like Michael said, even the appearance of impropriety is harmful to the overall trust of the Supreme Court. But the problem is, while those lower courts do have the ability to have oversight over ethics concerns, over recusals, the Supreme Court does not.
Yeah.
And in fact, Roberts even says that they often consult with ethics rules of the lower courts, but they don't have to follow them. And he's even defended them not having to follow them by basically saying, well, there's no court higher than the Supreme Court. So the only people that could try to demand a recusal or try to enforce a recusal would be other people on the bench, which they might do that because they're trying to affect the ruling.
Yep.
It's like, okay, maybe, but does that mean the solution is just no fucking ethics rules? Also,
yeah, exactly.
His big legal defense, Chief Justice Roberts's big legal defense, is the fact that Congress created the lower courts, but the Constitution created the Supreme Court. And because of that, Congress can make ethics rules for the lower courts, but they're not allowed to make ethics rules for the Supreme Court.
Yeah. I got to say, I'm going to call bullshit on that. You know why I'm going to call bullshit on that? Because ultimately, Congress has the ability to impeach Supreme Court justices, right? They are, you know, they serve under good behavior, right? Which means that Roberts's point, which is essentially that you can't make ethics rules for us because you can't provide consequences for our actions. You can't like change the law. You can't do all this kind of stuff. That's not true. there is a consequence they can do. Now it's political because impeachment is inherently a political process. But if you have a list of things which you are not allowed to do, it becomes way easier and way more convincing to be able to say, well, you did one of these things, we're going to impeach you. Like, you can write down a list of things that they're not allowed to do, that if they violate, they're supposed to like serve some consequence. So it was really disheartening though to like see that all 9 justices signed onto a letter basically saying that like there's nothing anybody can do to impose ethics requirements on them. It was like, now I don't know if it's like all because they think that they shouldn't be bound by ethics rules, or if it's just they don't think it's worth wading into some of the constitutional and legal questions about whether they can be bound by ethics rules. But like, that's just a really unfortunate thing to see, even from the liberal justices on the court.
Yeah. And apparently in terms of corruption on the Supreme Court, the last point I want to make is it's not just Thomas.
Yeah.
It was recently revealed that Gorsuch was trying to sell a property for more than 2 years, and he finally found a buyer. The buyer was a chief executive of some massive law firm, and he happens to purchase it 9 days after Gorsuch was confirmed to the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yeah.
You think those two things might have something to do with each other?
Yeah. No, the property was there for 2 years, but as soon as he was on the Supreme Court, oh my God, the property is so much more valuable. We really have to buy it.
So it is such a shame that the highest court in the land has lower ethics rules. I mean, here, let me give you an example real quick. So there's no requirements in a lot of these situations for these justices to recuse themselves from potential court cases that involve their friends, which, by the way, there was actually a copyright dispute involving one of the companies that Crow was a partial owner of in 2005, which Thomas did not recuse himself on.
Yep.
So I'm a coach for the speech team. All right. And I am not allowed to judge my own students. And in fact, if I ever coached another student, like from another team within the last 3 years, I have to go to the people running the tournament and tell them, you need to block me from judging this person. I am required to do that.
Yeah.
I have higher ethical standards imposed on me as a fucking speech coach and a fucking speech judge than the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The highest law of the land.
I work for a bank and I have stricter ethics requirements than the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land.
Oh, that hurts.